Hello, everyone. My name is Harry
Hello.
LaFontaine. I'm from World of History. We're gonna have to edit that. All right.
Yeah, well, happy new year. I let's see. Okay, restart. Let go on because
Yeah.
restart simply
No, I'm
means
just gonna.
cut that.
Yeah, I'll just keep the recording going because
Mhm.
we can edit it. All right. So
All right.
I'll introduce myself, and I'll introduce my channel. Then you introduce yourself and your channel. How's that?
All right.
Okay.
I don't know. Let's
Yeah,
see
we're
what
good.
happens.
Here we go. Here we go. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, everyone. My name is Harry LaFontaine from the World of History YouTube channel, and I'm here with.
Schwerpunkt. Here I am from the homonymous channel, and today we're gonna go Viking together with Harry, isn't it? Right?
Yep, we're gonna go Viking, and we've decided to do this collaboration together as a result of my finding out that December is Vikings month, which I had no idea, and neither of us are necessarily experts in this particular area of history, but I think we can provide some pretty good insights into many of the different elements that took place throughout the Viking Age, and share in a nice conversation with each other for everyone.
Sure. I think it's simply taking a broader look at the age, at the time, just all the interactions that characterize this period, because I think that's, at the end of the day, the most important thing of these people that didn't even write on its own, basically. So it's mostly also about the perception that we have about the Norse and the Vikings, in fact. And so let's start this.
All right, so the Viking Age that began in what 793 with the raid on Lindisfarne. Now,
Conventionally,
yeah,
yes.
you conventionally, you could frame it the direct way and say the Viking Age was specifically from 793 to 1066, from
Mm-hmm.
the invasion on Lindisfarne to William the Bastard's victory over the Anglo-Saxons at what bridge was that?
Well, it was, of course, the defeat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in
Yes,
1066. Yeah.
yes,
Right.
yeah. You could frame
That
it
was a
that way.
pretty amazing, yeah. And I think it fits well for like the ending of the Viking era. Like, even though not much practically changed, I mean, immediately in those time, I mean, in Scandinavia, especially, of course, in Britain, it was a big deal. But yeah, I think especially with the death of Harald Hardrada, that man was a symbol of something great and of a period that had developed itself, like throughout the previous centuries. Like you can see an evolution, even the same Scandinavian society that got to that point, right? And yeah, and surely, with Hastings, the whole thing changes. A big deal in Britain for sure, for England.
Yes, I agree, and I find it to be a little bit humorous and somewhat ironic that
Mm-hmm.
the descendants, William the Bastard was descendant from Rollo, who was uh,
Yep.
first given that was just the county of Rouen, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then yeah, I just find it fitting. It's a good way to encapsulate the entire period, and then but then you could go from the broader perspective, and you could say the Viking Age went from around the time they acquired the technology for putting sails on their ships, because prior to that they
Mm-hmm.
were just rowing everywhere. Once
Mm-hmm.
they got sails, that changed and revolutionized their ability to travel, and then so that happened, I think, towards the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, so around the year 700, and then
Mm-hmm.
the Norse religious culture lasted well into the 14th and 15th centuries, even after the converting of all three of those countries that they weren't countries at the time during the actual like peak of the Viking Age, but ultimately they became Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and that only took place once those land masses, the people in those land masses, those tribal leaders began converting to Christianity, and then they were evolving from a democratic / republic governmental apparatus into the kingship style governmental apparatus, which was a direct result of Christianization.
Yes, and surely by imitation of broader systems of government and military organization, that was also what pushed through piracy and conquest and colonization. Surely also the Viking era as such, right? And that's in fact one of the aspects, in my opinion, that is very overlooked in the broader picture. I mean, how same Scandinavia and the Jutland also, changed their own societies from the within largely, right? Because objectively they weren't invaded in that sense. So it's something that they began to develop on their own. And there is this, as you said, in fact, this democratic origin that we often attach to Viking, like to Scandinavian society, and still largely, I think, stereotypically to the Viking way, like the idea of being this raiders and tradesmen and pirates contraposed to the great monarchies of the continent, but also Britain. But it's in fact the same Viking era, the catalyzing dynamic that brings those same Norse to transform their own society, to stratify it, and to increase and to centralize power, and to create more robust hierarchies, and to take the thing at the next level. Even though, of course, it was a very slow process, as we know, the Scandinavian monarchies took a lot of time to develop fully in like the rest of the continental ones, right, of the Frankish origin throughout the low Middle Ages. So it's a big deal, in my opinion, to look at this period, because it's also partly very controversial, right? What is that brings the I can say progress, because I don't like this word as it's often used, but
evolution.
The idea of a society that is able to order itself, but through partially also the loss of a part of the freedom of the population, right?
Yeah, and that's I don't like that term either, and I would go to evolution for that term. It's similar to the way if you just look at the so-called downfall or collapse of the Roman Empire, and so many people have this opinion that one day when this final emperor was deposed, then the whole world changed immediately. Yeah, it's nothing like that. It takes such a long time, and I could attribute, if you want to go to a very broad kind of spectrum, the collapse of the West and subsequent evolution of the West with the Christian elements that were involved into the 8th and 9th centuries, with Charlemagne in particular, when he began to subjugate people and exercise his hegemony violently through forced conversions and things like that. Like this behavior was making its way into Jutland, certainly, and they were intensely aware of the fact that these Christians were just killing pagans, killing people who weren't Christian, and trying to exercise sovereignty over them, in which they were, like you said, a strictly democratic type of society for a very long time. And so this stuff was definitely major warning signs for the Danish, especially, or I don't even know if they were Danish at that time, but the people living on the Jutland Peninsula at that time.
Yeah,
and so
the Danes, you can.
Yeah, so I mean, they were definitely taking measures to protect themselves from invasion by land, with the I can't recall what it was called, but there was like a
The
wall.
Dannevirke.
What?
Yeah. The Dannevirke should be, if I'm not wrong. So the Dannevirke, which just etymologically, I'm not sure, but it should be like the work of the Danes, like meaning this sort of wall, this ditch.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a military engineering fit for the time.
Mm-hmm.
A bit like Offa's dike in Britain. Was similar. It's interesting. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, surely the Jutland was the most exposed to a next step of an eventual Frankish expansionism, and they were the guys who developed, in fact, more rapidly those models that they imitated from the same Franks in terms of monarchy. But there were also other factors, like the Jutland is easier to control than certain areas, of course, of Sweden, of Norway. There are tougher grounds, and that facilitated the creation of certain broader aristocracies, I mean, more powerful aristocracies, landowner and controlling the territory. Yeah, and the Christianization, of course, to say halt because we are Christians now, so you have a reason less to touch us. That's fine.
Yeah, so I will ask you to elaborate on this then. So with the start of the Viking Age being considered the raid of Lindisfarne in 793, and since we've already discussed the land wall or the earthen wall that was built there by the Danes during the reign of Charlemagne, in 782, Charlemagne ordered the death of about 4,500 Saxons. And Saxony at that time is in northern Germany, right near the area where
the Jutland,
yeah, right where the Jutland Peninsula juts off of the main European mainland, right there. Do you think that the massacre of the Saxons there in 782 would have, like, what kind of impact do you think that would have had, not only on the Danes deciding that they needed to build this wall and protect themselves, but also what impact do you think that may have had on their desire, not only the Danes, but the Scandinavia as a whole, in terms of them heading over and starting to attack the Christian monasteries in the British Isles?
This is a great question. I mean, because it implies a lot of things. I think, well, if I'm not wrong, the Dannevirke was already existing in part in some, like, since the 7th century. So I think more than just the Frankish expansionism, it was like from the Danish rulers to say, okay, here the Jutland begins, and here we are, and you are from the other side, right? You know, so that the Saxons and the Danes were at this point at least somewhat different, like surely similar. And surely the massacre at Verden is, you know, a very important turn point, because that's really the subjugation of Saxony, and this big show off from Charlemagne, saying, you know, here you simply cannot exist. Like at the time, we are used to think this was surely a very violent period on its own. So these were things that more or less in smaller scale happen a bit everywhere. But even for the time, the sources recorded it, and same Frankish sources, in fact, that were also for the sake of, in fact, of propaganda, like a bit of a deterrent factor. I mean, many people think, in fact, that so many Saxons weren't quite literally killed. Maybe it's just their chieftains, like to behead their own oligarchies and show them how that they couldn't resist, right? And we know, in fact, that the Saxons would keep resisting because they were absolutely, you know, they absolutely didn't like that. They were perfectly aware of what was going on, because that was an invasion, right? You know, aside from the strictly religious point of view, that's, you know, you can trace back the relation between the Franks and the Saxons in the previous centuries. previous 2 centuries, like characterized substantially by this continuous warfare on the frontier that was incidentally the same place from which the Carolingians themselves emerged, because they were from the easternmost area of the Austrasia, bordering the Saxons, and the Saxons launching these periodical raids deep into like the Rhine Valley in these important economical areas in Central Europe. And regarding to the reaction of the Danes, well, surely, yeah, they were aware of that, and I don't know I don't remember honestly, nor I know, I think, specifically of we have an historical record of the immediate reaction of the Danes in front of the massacre at Verden. But I think in general it's obvious that the conquest of Saxony would scare them, because they knew that the Carolingians at that point were a hell of a political power, especially a military machine that they didn't have the means to cope with.
Mm-hmm.
So on the long run, surely in the centuries, that was a reason why, especially Denmark, tried to be very careful. And actually, the Danes threatened, I think, Charlemagne, and they sent raiding. They started raiding, in fact, the Flemish and the French, I used the modern term, coasts, and created a lot of problems, especially after the Carolingians had knocked out the Frisians and their navy, their piracy. So many think that, in fact, Danish expansionism at that point, with all the other factors, was triggered in part also by the vacuum that had been left out with the destruction of the Frisians at the hands of the Carolingians. And then we know how that escalated in France with raids from, but not just from Denmark, of course, but from the whole Scandinavia. And relatively to the last point, I think I'm not really sure. Like we can, I mean, whether the religious factor was a real thing. Like, if it was much of a matter of like belief versus belief. It's rather thinking that, at least I interpret it in this way, is that the church, that the Christian church was just like one element of the whole system that the Franks at that time wanted to export as conquerors, right? Mm-hmm. So that included, for example, in Saxony, like the Frankish priesthood was also used to control, in fact, the local population and the feelings towards the Frankish rule and all this stuff. I mean, there was this eminently political role that the church had in that sense as well. And sure, there is that probably, but I'm not really sure whether the Viking era was triggered by the threat, like, what could really a Swedish, if we can say, or maybe a Norwegian fear from the Frank. I mean, it depends. Also because the initial Viking raids, I think the first century or so, seem not to have been very, very coordinated as such. I mean, the Carolingians also, during their civil wars, called bands of Vikings to send against one another, stuff like that. So probably there is something structural and big behind this that probably has to do, as you know, with certain probably environmental problems.
Certainly.
That the North was facing. But definitely on the international political arena, these two systems were now put into one, not necessarily all one against the others as such, but that there was definitely two different visions of the world that also caused probably some interest and intersection between the two, right? So that probably the Scandinavian aristocracy was very interested in what the Carolingians were doing, because they were hoping to apply some of that in their lands too, which the rest of, let's say, freemen probably wasn't very fond of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the environmental factors, and my opinion is that, like many other so-called ages, there are many factors. So you have, in this case, you have environmental factors, you have these religious elements, and then you have the sort of contest between the Scandinavians and the mainland Europeans. And I think with the tribal leaders of Denmark in particular, but also throughout Scandinavia, and their understanding of what was happening in mainland Europe and their understanding of the military machine that was on the other side, that militarily would lead them to encourage raids and other activities along those lines in almost like a Sun Tzu kind of approach, to where you're avoiding what is strong and attacking what is weak. And so their conclusion would have been to start with raiding and head towards the British Isles and head down the coasts and head up the rivers and things like that, and to appear where you're not expected and things of that nature, which may have been the only way they could have even came onto level ground, militarily speaking, with the fact that there was a contest between, I suppose, monotheism and polytheism. There would have been a contest developing there, and that was the only way for the Scandinavians to make a significant military impact and a significant political impact in opposition to what would be the Christians, but also with the migration of the Anglos and the Saxons into the British Isles. They would have been intimately aware of that, and they would have also been intimately aware of the religious landscape of that area, and the fact that they were nowhere near as capable as the Carolingian Empire in terms of mustering a large military or navy, or both. And so they were, while it may have been unorganized, being that that a kingship was absent at that time, as a society, the primary leaders would have understood that this was kind of like us versus them, us against them. And with that, though, obviously they had trading in mind, they had exploring in mind, and there were multiple approaches taking place from Scandinavia, and that resulted in a very broad approach to what mainland Europe was doing at that time. And it was like, if you look at the Swedes and they're traveling into north central Europe through the Ural River, and there's another river up in that area, but they were heading into what would be modern Western day Russia. And then on the other side, they are heading straight towards the British Isles. So it's almost like an umbrella. If you look at the map of what was taking place during that time, it's like they're forming an umbrella around what is
it's like a crescent.
Yeah, it's like this part is impenetrable, but if we form this umbrella collectively around this impenetrable force, then we may find weaknesses, which they ultimately did, especially in France, or modern day France. It was the Carolingian Empire, and entering mainland Europe via the river systems on the outskirts of France, and that led to that led to what many know as the Danegeld, and led to further writings from like bishops and Christian historians, which in no way am I making an attempt to degrade those people, but when looking at sources and trying to gather an opinion for yourself of all the things that took place during this time, the Viking people, the Scandinavian people, weren't literate in the same way that the mainland Europeans
Sure.
were. They did not have any kind of system of creating like an annals or having an ongoing story writing process that was taking place simultaneously as things were happening. This didn't happen for the Scandinavians until they actually did begin to convert and recognize the ability of the mainland Europeans to communicate via writing directly to one another and writing books and things like that. This was not even in existence for these people in the 8th and even into the 9th centuries. They became familiar with it. I mean, I'm sure they had seen books and probably, threw them on the ground during a raid or whatever the case. But this was foreign to them. And then as leaders developed the understanding that this ability to communicate via writing and the effectiveness of being able to do that in terms of sovereignty became invaluable to them over time. But initially, it was like an immovable force versus this maneuverable object. The immovable force being the European mainland, and themselves being this multifaceted mobile object that could do nothing other than take advantage of weaknesses and avoid strengths.
Yeah, and they were very clever at doing that. I mean, you can always see a logic in everything. You know what was going on, right? It was interesting when you talked about this broader geographical dimension, right, and the fact that they were there to exploit like trade activities and so on. And if you consider especially that, I don't know, during the Viking era, also the Mediterranean was pretty messed up. The Saracen invasions and all that weren't even in there just all destruction and everything. It was also trade, right? And the slavery trade, and that's very similar, comparable to what was happening in the north.
If you allow me to interject for just a moment, you have to take that into consideration when thinking about the way the Mediterranean was during this time span, and the fact, essentially, those mainland Europeans that I was just mentioning are facing their own immovable object in terms of the Muslim world, the Islamic world, and they had no choice other than to spread their wings in another direction, because there was no way that they were going to contest that in a way that allowed them to reign supreme, so to speak.
Yeah. There was an implosion in Central Europe fundamentally that these peoples were able to exploit, because in my opinion, the Viking era began in fact before the Carolingian Empire was in open crisis, let's say. But I think it's it happens many times. Also with the Roman Empire, had happened essentially the same way. Is that when you see that the big giant is starting to crumble, it starts becoming like a huge carcass that you want to take a bit of, right? All these, small, in fact, bands of monarchs and of pirates that know how to deal with that. They're, when the central authority collapses, that's their realm, right? And they know how to make the best use of that. And through this, they traded extensively, because we forget, in fact, that we like somehow to highlight the violence, right? Of course the destruction, the enslavement, etc. But that goes always with trade at the same time. You can find in Viking Dublin, stuff that the Vikings brought from Central Asia. You realize that they were like one of the major commercial they had built by themselves with their boats, with their activities, this major commercial highway that had a transcontinental dimension, because you find stuff that comes from, like, I don't know, Buddhist statues you find in Sweden, right, or stuff that's far from to Iceland from Asia, right? And you start saying, well, this is what they were doing at the time, and you start drawing what this net was about, and how effective they were in exploiting that with those means, and with with that capability. I mean, and that's impressive, because if you talk about the Mediterranean, you see that, that those were kind of already fairly way more advanced civilizations that had the kind of commercial systems and for millennia, and then you find instead in this early medieval Europe, in the far north, in basically the most depressed area, you find all these abilities and energies that are put in motion, which is amazing in my opinion. It's great, and that paradoxically, came to benefit from which came to benefit on the longer run. Also, the same, let's say, continental Europeans, right? Because also, with the Carolingian Empire, this broader trade system in the North Sea, etc., was starting being developed, and in spite of warfare and this, terrible events, still the system kept growing. This is amazing. Both, let's say, 9th to 10th century Europe, that in spite of all this so-called second invasions, the system started taking shape. Probably also through this hardships, right? That obliged the local communities to take care of themselves by themselves, right? And starting to build from that phase, and counting their resources carefully and making logical choices. So yeah, that's very powerful in my opinion.
I agree. Yeah, I agree completely. And then I take into further consideration, maybe a little bit later on into the late 10th, early 11th, and then definitely in the 12th century, the absolute power that was overwhelming coming from the Islamic world, in which the Silk Road trade routes were essentially being controlled by the Islamic world itself. And so this creates a further need for places like Constantinople and the Central European lands and the mainland Western Europe to seek trade elsewhere. And obviously, the Vikings, if we're going to call them that, were very interested in this because they stood to gain by this. And so the Swedes in particular took great advantage of this in their exploitation of those river systems and their ability to reach places like the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and to reach as far as reach as far as Mesopotamia, and to be able to, like you said, acquire goods from the East itself, that managed to make their way all the way back to Scandinavia during this time. And that's incredible to me, but I don't think it's possible without the rise of Islam.
Yes, Islam indeed at one point opened that the world that had been always contended before between the Romans and the Persians, at some point subjectively opening massive trade highways between the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, etc., the Far East. So yeah, these were big traffics as well. And that's where the Vikings, in fact, started, also connecting themselves, because they recognized that's where the wealth came from. So.
And it had an interesting effect on the way the Scandinavian peoples, based on their own homeland origin, and the way they interacted with everything that was taking place during that time, because you had the Swedes actually going into these river systems and forging colonies, and ultimately developing a long-term state, sort of like a merging between the Swedes and the people of the steppe. So think of the Mongols or the Huns, and those kinds of peoples merging together in this sort of middle ground in the northwestern steppe lands, which ultimately resulted in the Russian Empire. And that's just remarkable to me. While you consider on the other side, in Western Europe, in the North Sea, an entirely different world was developing. And that was mainly, the main contributors to that were obviously the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes and the Norwegians, and plenty took place over there. That's what everyone, that's what most people tend to focus on, is the evolution of the far northwestern Europe and France in particular, or modern day France in particular, and the British Isles, along with Norway and Denmark, as we would call them today. And it's like there were two different apparati evolving on their own independent levels simultaneously all throughout this period. And that resulted in a lot of very interesting developments in terms of peoples assimilating with one another over within large land masses, and those peoples assimilating with one another ultimately developed entire new societies and entire new governmental systems that in their own ways still exist today. And that is absolutely powerful. And
that's amazing. Yes.
Yeah, it's just a testament to the personal strength, discipline, and hardiness of these Norsemen. We can just call them Norsemen.
Absolutely.
In terms of this, and it's mind blowing, and it's multifaceted, and the impact it had on the world today is still present. It's as present as the impact that the Roman Empire had in its totality, including the Eastern Roman period after the evolution of the West, and then also the evolution and rise of Islam. It's all one large picture, and it's very interesting to consider all the different elements that contributed to what took place over a period of centuries, that still does have relevance today.
It is, and I find fascinating. You're very right when you say that indeed what was created at the time is partly stands today, meaning that certain cultures that, especially in fact in British Isles, were heavily influenced at the time in their identity, in their culture, broader culture by the Viking element, I would say, and it's fascinating because up to the 19th century you see with nationalism that every country tried to focus mostly on the fact that we were always like that, like we were always English or we were always Irish or something like that, and you look at that world and you realize that it's exactly that conflict. I mean, this doesn't mean to dismiss the brutality of what happened and how it was happening, but it's the fact that take modern Ireland and Irish culture, and you realize that there is a deep Norse contribution to that, including some of the most important Irish cities that were basically founded at the time with the construction of the Viking circle camps, entrenched camps. That's the term, or even the same England that the time of the Norman invasion was de facto an Anglo-Danish kingdom by that point. So, and history might have gone also in a very different way. Like there are many similarities, especially between Anglo-Saxon England, indeed, and the Scandinavian world, of course, than what it was like with the Scandinavian world and Francia, for example, that are striking, that are important. In that sense, 1066 is really a meaningful date, because hadn't the Normans taken over, today we would probably conceive like Britain as a much more homogeneous element to Scandinavia than to like let's say strictly narrowest Western European country, or however in its English and its British specificity, right? So yeah. That's amazing indeed.
Absolutely, and that makes me cherish even more the rivalry between Alfred the Great and the Scandinavians during the time of the late 8th century, during his reign, and the fact that essentially, if you strip away a couple of centuries, these people are related, and it's very interesting to look at the dynamic that took place not only there but also in Ireland, as you mentioned, and with the North Sea Empire that eventually developed and came out of that whole picture, much later on. The fact that these peoples, it's like if you imagine northwestern mainland Europe and the Jutland, and then you transplant those populations that were forced out by the Carolingian Empire, and even prior to that, with the I'm losing the name of the empire that preceded them. I can't think of it, with Clovis and that empire.
Merovingian.
The Merovingian, yeah. So the Merovingian Empire, and then followed by the Carolingian Empire. These peoples were essentially forced from northwestern mainland Europe out into Scandinavia and the British Isles. And during that time, all these people were assimilating with one another, and all the same processes that were taking place that always take place when there's mass migrations and things like that. This took place during the height of the migration period, and then even beyond that. But then they're essentially relocated to the British Isles to more or less continue what had been left almost on pause due to the Merovingian and Carolingian empires. So it's like they paused for a century and a half or 2 centuries, and then just continued on in the end of the 8th century with the same sort of struggle for sovereignty that they had been embroiled in for centuries, if not a millennia, prior to them.
Yeah, if you look at Anglo-Saxon England before the Viking, before Lindisfarne and the subsequent events, they weren't that different. I mean, if you look even at how they organized their territorial rule, they were still very divided. I mean, seemingly, unfortunately, that's not a very well documented area, but we get to know the certain communities that lived in places like in Mercia and etc., that they still maintained their tribal name from the places where they had, the groups that they had settled there originally, and that they, of course, with all the changes that in those few centuries had happened. But I mean, this idea of being still with the tribal mindset of being part of that world was very strong, and that also helped, in my opinion, the Viking penetration of Britain as such, because of the differences and the rivalries that existed between let's say the south and places like Northumbria, that also sided basically with Vikings at one point, because they didn't like with the rise of Wessex, what was happening in the south, the creation of this broader, let's say, overrule that would evolve into the English monarchy.
Yeah, kingship.
So it's that's pretty, it's interesting to look at the let's say the lack of a unitary direction, how many things were still fluid and close to certain dynamics that we give for granted, like the fact that the migration era had somewhat stopped in the West. Instead, here the Viking era brings it there, like just it had happened in the centuries before. And in Scandinavia, and this is since you mentioned that the Swedes, the Varangians in the east, well, that was probably, Sweden is one of those countries where there are massive steppes influenced throughout all the this time of Viking era. You find a lot, even the equipment in archaeological finds, lots of kind of Eastern-like, steppes-like features that are pretty impressive, and that were in this sense, brought alongside even further west during this period through the Viking invasion. So, yeah, these are very fascinating worlds.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to consider these historical processes repeating themselves in terms of like if you look at the way the Roman Empire developed early on in assimilating all these different cultures and adopting their local societal standards and their religions and their governing apparatuses and all those kinds of things. It's interesting to me that very similar processes take place as the quote unquote civilized world expands out to these areas that seem to be a little bit further behind. And you could go back as far as like the way the Bronze Age worked out, where the entire Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, was at the height of the Bronze Age, while at this time places like Iberia and Gaul and Scandinavia and the British Isles and Ireland and everything, they were still in the Stone Age during this time. And then it wasn't until close to the end of the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean East, it wasn't until then that these outlier states were getting into the height of their own Bronze Ages. And so it's like this gradual process takes place, and being on the outskirts, it's like there's a constant delay, but the delay gets smaller and smaller in terms of years, up until you have this sort of a standardization economically speaking, with regards to like everyone being included. So like it's like you couldn't be included in an age that was taking place, or like in the standard whatever, like the high-end mainland goings on, until you adopted elements of their society. So it's almost in reverse as opposed to the Roman Empire, but it's still similar, where as they expanded, they just assimilated themselves and sort of adapted themselves to what that locality was like in terms of society and religion and everything else that was going on, as to where towards getting into the Viking Age, and even in the migration era, it was kind of in reverse, as to where we're going to expand, but instead of becoming part of what's happening in these places, you have no choice other than to become part of what we have going on, or we're going to wipe you out. And that's a stark contrast, and it makes me think about like the Roman Christian persecutions versus the forced conversions that were taking place. It makes me think about that stuff because in the modern world, the forced conversions that took place are essentially forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they were, in many cases, like exponentially more severe in terms of the violence and the number of deaths that had to take place in order for this process to happen. In Rome, it was far more localized, and it was much smaller than it's made out to be. And in the modern world today, looking back on it, for the things that took place and the way they took place, it's odd to me that persecutions that may have numbered, in the 5, 6, 7,000 range, maybe even as high as 10,000 people were killed, tortured, things like that, martyred, if you will, throughout 300 years in the Roman Empire, through the 4 main persecutions and other local persecutions and stuff like that. You've only got a relatively small number with consideration for how huge of a factor it is in people's minds. But then simultaneously, you have the forced conversions, which the numbers of people killed and tortured and all of that were much, much greater. But the thing that doesn't get taken into consideration is the fact that there were far less people. Because the Roman Empire at its height, the population of the Mediterranean in the 2nd century, just the Mediterranean alone, the Roman Empire alone, was probably double the population of mainland Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles just those few centuries later, due to many environmental factors. So yeah, so you've got these forced conversions in statistically speaking, it's like if you have 10,000 forced conversion deaths in the 9th century in northwestern Europe, that's equal to 40,000 persecution deaths just based on the difference in population alone. So you've got 1 out of every 4 people versus 1 out of every 16 people. And yet somehow this is overlooked in modern society.
Yeah, especially, well, Saxony was brutal. Like, that was really hammering them down every time that they revolted. Like, it was it took a lot of, like, several decades to accomplish that, because they kept rebelling. And at the end, it was a success, because eventually Germany the Eastern Frankish Kingdom wouldn't rebel anymore, and that the Carolingians achieved what the Romans hadn't achieved to do. That is, what fundamentally to occupy Germany for good, like, for forever at that point. So yeah, indeed, what is fascinating, excuse me, in my opinion, is when you look at also however Christianity spread, like, elsewhere, because we know in Scandinavia that there was something like that at the time of Olaf II, for example. There were fights, in fact, between the Norwegians over essentially, like, over this religious province, like, accepting from a monarchic, this monarchic imposition of this religion. And at the same time, I would say that this is at least how I interpret it. And of course, it's mostly mean that you see that it's often a clash between the elites, right? It's a clash between people who rule and who have interest in what that also religious model and consequently political and social model entails, right? That's why, because about Berthen, before I was mentioning the fact that the same Carolingian sources needed to emphasize the bloodshed, right? Because they really wanted to make a huge impression about it. But today we can think, like, it wasn't exactly like that. Like, that was probably a very severe lesson, like, with probably literally the beheading of lots of people, like chiefly chieftains and those who had rebelled against Frankish rule. But sometimes for the rest, it's talking about the rest of the population. I think just war in itself would kill lots of people. That's like the major factor. If you invade Saxony, if you start, waging war around, you need food. You need provisions in a land that is already quite poor, because Saxony is what it is at this time. And you can imagine the famine, the farms destroyed, all this stuff. While what is interesting is that how Christianity, in my opinion, spreads autonomously, without arms. I mean, without the need of using arms to impose it. Like, it's a phenomenon that on many occasions starts, like, it's a very autonomous process, right? Especially in Scandinavia, in the depths of Scandinavia, but also in the British Isle in the previous centuries, right? And you understand that in that sense there are different levels at which this happens, for which the Carolingian conquest, that's really a conquest. So that is as brutal as it can be. While if you start, I don't know, founding monasteries, and how it happened in Ireland, how it happened, it's very interesting that the exchanges in this sense between Anglo-Saxon England and Gaelic Ireland, and even the missionary waves that came from the British Isles into the same Carolingian Empire, where Christianity was barely, like, especially in the eastern regions, was was barely there. I mean, that people didn't quite even understand what it was about. So yeah, there is a lot of violence involved. There is at the same time also the reverse, like people who started acting Christian because maybe they felt that the paganism, as we define it, that it was a very different thing. Telling truth, that paganism is kind of, I can say offensive, but it's, it was the Christian nickname, right? Because these guys came from the countryside, from the Pagi, hence pagan. But there are sagas that naturally are written in different contexts that show that at one point that there were kind of spontaneous conversions to Christianity, rejecting the pagan model, because they thought it wouldn't work anymore. I made a video about this, that is Christian faith and Germanic rite, if I'm not wrong. There is the Helgi saga, if I'm not wrong. It talks exactly about this. At one point, basically, this guy refuses to gods because they have failed him. Because in pagan contractualism, it's don't s, right? It's either, it's like a contract, right? If I give this to the divinity can be pleased with that and can reward me, right? And at that point, this guy, he was a priest, by the way. He was a pagan priest. He got destroyed by another pagan rival faction, and he says, this deity didn't protect me, so you know what, I embrace Christianity. And the interesting fact about that is that he's a warrior, actually, and he adopts Christianity also in this kind of violent sense, meaning that it was more functional to his lifestyle. It was pretty, we could say Viking, pretty warlike in his own regard, and that decides to embrace this belief, because that's technically what theism is. Like, whereas paganism is more like a different relation, so sometimes a deeper relation, also a more confused, but also more inebriating. I don't know how to define that.
Well,
however, shows you this words in transition on its own, which is very interesting, because that goes aside just from the violence of a forced conversion, and it shows you how the mindset of these people was changing progressively, being acquainted to certain ideas or not. And I don't know what your thoughts are about this. I'm quite curious about it.
Yep. You said the key word in there, and it was, what is my reward for this? So it's in these pagan cultures, it was you were determined to obtain an earthly reward for your sacrifice or your praise of this deity, and those earthly rewards, in my opinion, the reward of literacy and the reward of broadened trade is, I think those are the two primary factors in the spread of Christianity through these places, is because they were focused on an earthly and almost immediate kind of reward that was tangible to them, that was a result of their accepting of this deity. And I know that throughout these places, the British Isles in the 5th and 6th centuries, even into the 7th century, and Ireland as well, and then later on into Scandinavia itself, it was that ideology that led them to begin converting and to convert their populace along with them from a noble perspective, because they stood to gain this literacy, this ability to communicate over vast swathes of land, and this ability to trade over those same lands. And over time, I think the mainlanders began to realize this, and so that's what caused them to feel, I guess, righteous, for lack of a better word. That's what caused them to begin to feel righteous about their forced conversions, because it was like the people of the countryside were lacking in awareness in terms of what this particular god had to offer. Because prior to then, people were assimilating Christ or Christianity itself, even Judaism in some places in in like Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Western Asia, throughout like modern day Ukraine area.
Mm-hmm.
They stood to gain these tangible and immediate rewards. And I think from the perspective of the people who were propagating this system, they realized that if they cut these things off, like say for example, we're not going to trade with you as a nation. We're not going to trade with you unless you're a Christian, or we're not going to teach you our language or teach you how to communicate the way we do over these large stretches of land unless you're a Christian. So like it was like they were phasing it out, while at the same time I think realizing that the barbarous population needed to be dealt with more with force. And it was sort of in the minds of the people who were conducting these conversions, it was for their own good, the people who they were forcing to convert, because it was like they didn't know any better. And I find that to be interesting, and it's the same as I mentioned before, with things being in reverse from the way the Roman Empire expanded and how they assimilated themselves into these localities. It started at some point to reverse itself, and it became we're taking this territory and we're going to, instead of assimilate ourselves, we are going to force your tribal leaders, your chieftains, your local governors to assimilate themselves into our society. And then once that happens, instead of having like from a ground up approach, like there was in the past, it became a trickle down kind of approach, where like if we can get this tribal leader to understand what he has immediately available to him in terms of trade and literacy, those kinds of things, then it will ultimately trickle down. And in cases where it didn't trickle down, then that leader would be held at fault, would most likely be executed or exiled, and then that populace would be forced to convert. And that was so that they could sort of like join into what would have been modern Europe at that time.
Mm-hmm. So you see, I mean, this great difference between, because the Romans, according to me, did that a bit as well. I mean, it was at the end of the day always winning over the elites, right? So that these were the big, chieftains, the big chiefs that, with all their clienteles, controlled effectively the territory, right? So objectively, the Carolingians, especially in certain areas, really substituted the elites. Like especially in Saxony, in part they wiped. In part, they of course, they intermarried as well. But I would say there wasn't probably like, even if you look at, I don't know, the Frankish Salian law and the Saxon laws. I mean, these weren't. I mean, so much different peoples, in my opinion. Like they were kind of they were cousins, sort of, even socially speaking, or especially in the eastern part of the Carolingian Empire. That even Christianization was already very superficial, especially among the countryside. And I think that also the rest of the population, I mean, in the rural areas, didn't quite. I mean, they could formally convert to Christianity, but it's not that they would lose actually their cults, like their lifestyle. Also because that was practically impossible. I mean, it took a lot to make them understand what Christianity was in the first place, and probably most of them never did, right? Mm-hmm. There are beautiful examples of this. Like it's mostly about controlling the people who can make trouble, than rather. And of course, in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, this tension existed. However, there was also the Ständiger revolt and the there was a reaction from the middle classes, especially, that allied themselves with even with the serfs, with the slaves, which was something incredible, because like for a Germanic freeman, the slave is basically not even a human being, but they ally themselves to fight the elite that has bought into to the Carolingian model, and is making a social engineering for which they're stratifying society, and the freemen are losing their freedom in great part. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a big struggle actually, and it's in.
Hello?
Hey there.
Yep, I lost you there. I don't know how that happened.
Oh, okay.
You had you had left off.
Made my point clear.
Well, it cut off. It cut off about a minute ago.
All right.
You had left off. You had said. You had said. Like. You left off at like the controlling elite.
Yeah. Yeah, that's more or less what I wanted to say. So I didn't add excessively much.
Oh, okay. All right.
So yeah.
All right. Yeah. So okay.
It doesn't ruin.
Yeah. So continuing on then, going back with that was my take on what you were saying was that based on my opinion in terms of how this reversal sort of took place over time, and your response was along the lines of that the controlling elite were being stubborn about this conversion. I think in those cases that's where you end up with this sort of domination of these peoples and these sovereignties. But in the cases where I would call it like, it was like the development of kingship. It was like the areas that did not understand that if our leaders don't sort of come together with what the modern world has going on, because to be frank, which ironic term in itself, it's like these leaders who didn't understand that there was a difference between their world and this other world, did not recognize the difference between the fact that the world they were dealing with, which was trying to get them to conform to it, was the modern world, so to speak. And so that goes back to my saying that it's like when I was talking about the Bronze Age, on how like the Eastern Mediterranean was 1,000 or more years ahead of Northwestern Europe in terms of the Bronze Age versus the Stone Age. It's kind of the same thing, but on a smaller scale, because you've got it takes a lower number of years for these things to develop as humanity develops. And so with that, these rulers that did not see the difference between their world and the modern world that was coming for them, those were the guys that were ultimately kind of like wiped out, and then you had like the annexing of territories and things
they
like
were
that. But
doomed.
yeah, but otherwise,
Exactly.
other
That's the point.
yeah, but otherwise you were assimilated into the feudalistic society that was developing, and that it was kingship was developing, and that's I think that's where the barrier was in certain areas, whether they be in like Central Europe area or out on northwestern Europe or in the British Isles or even in Scandinavia itself. It's that they did not see the kingship style of leadership was what was modern and what was going to be necessary in order to be able to not only interact on sort of like a level playing field with the rest of Europe and even into like the Near East, but they wanted to oppose it, but unfortunately from a military standpoint it was impossible, and that kind of like leads all the way back to like why would the Scandinavians make this sort of like blockade to mainland Europe off the Jutland and then start spreading this umbrella over the top of it. And I think it's because those types of leaders who were resistant to, I guess, modernization, they wanted to defeat it, and they were trying to find ways to infiltrate it and maybe sort of encapsulate it or like cut it off from the societies that were on the other side of it in a sort of way, and that led to the main events that people know of that took place during the Viking Age itself, and that's especially the invasions into the British Isles, and then also especially the entry into the Frankish Empire via the river systems, and the first Danegeld that took place, and then how that sort of developed from there, and the rewarding of the county of Rouen to Rollo the Walker, is that what they called him? And his sort of like objective was, you're going to be accepted into our modern world, our modern literate free trade world, as long as you, at the very minimum, feign conversion. But your job is to prevent others from entering these river systems. So it was sort of like a hybrid. And that's the word I was trying to get to, was like this hybrid kind of society where the Norwegians and the Swedes sort of became hybrids in their own right, because the Swedes went east and the Norwegians went west, and then the Danes in the middle sort of like provided more leadership, I think, than the Swedes or the Nords did respectively, but simultaneously their population in terms of providing pirates or soldiers or tradesmen, things like that, like they were more like changeable. They were the sort of like adapting force that kind of like created this glue that ultimately led to the establishment of the kingships in Scandinavia, and the ultimate like conversion into like the full Christian world, full Christianization that took place in, you know, like the late 12th, early 13th centuries and beyond. And it's all very interesting to look at and dissect. And, you know, my mind is always trying to take some kind of like psychological approach to all of this stuff, which it's unfortunate that I can't just like travel around in time and be present for a year here and a year there just to really get a firsthand perspective. But I look at the historical sources, and especially during this time, they were bishops and people like that. They were scribes of the church, things of that nature. So it's really hard to filter that stuff, because you got to figure there's an incredible amount of bias involved in these transcriptions, and there's no ability to transcribe on the other side, which then further supports my attestation that ultimately these peoples joining this society from the leadership down, and that trickle down kind of effect was it was a desirous attempt to get these earthly rewards from these deities, or this deity. And this deity at that time, all throughout a few centuries there, was the one that was providing the best possible trade scenarios, the best possible communication scenarios, the best possible governmental scenarios, the best possible traveling scenarios, cartography, like all of that stuff was all taking place in this like large like nutshell, essentially. And that's kind of, I tend to look at all elements of history in that sort of way, if I'm able. Obviously, I have my own biases, but I try to make sure anytime I recognize that I'm exercising some sort of bias, that I just remove those lenses of who I am and what my beliefs may be, so that I can find my own way to deliver the most clear picture of what was really going on, not only in terms of like the events that took place, but what would have been going on within the minds of the people who were birthing these events into existence.
Yeah. And that's the challenge. I mean, nobody can ever accomplish that. We can't get closer, and that's fascinating. You can't understand it through many things. I mean, not just through written records. I mean, you can't even see and think how they lived, just to get an idea of what it more or less, very, very, very approximately could be like, what all these things could mean. And I think you really got at the point, like it was great when you said about the hybrid, right, and how these, the transformation from within the same Scandinavian world were triggered, like as a response to this trap, or this models that these competitive models they were confronted with, and that's what started in turn their own transformation to cope with that, and it was a great struggle within those same societies at that point. Also because, if you consider the Viking expeditions as such, I mean, those were like within the Germanic world. There is the warrior that goes out there and whole his life since his youth, and fights and kills and robs, and then maybe settles somewhere else. But then there is also the farmer. There is also the relatively peaceful trader, let's say, and these are two different systems that kind of need one another at one point, and that's where you understand that also the problem. How can you control these bands, for example? But paradoxically, these bands become, through the wealth that they take back to where they came from, the base of the construction and structuration of this more robust hierarchies that from which the monarchy would evolve fundamentally. So surely they perceived that. I mean, it was a change that probably caused a lot of problems, because those walls, Norse society was based on this very clear social contract, on the base of which everything had to remain within the, nobody had to get too powerful within society. That the society watched over this everyone, so that they couldn't take over the freedom of the other people. Instead, these guys that go across the sea and come back loaded with gold and riches of all kinds of slaves, etc. And they come back home, and then they immediately build up their military clientele, and they're able to overthrow that system. And that's what the Viking era, according to me, is extremely fascinating because it's the way of, say, changing your own. It's civilization, in my opinion. And civilization passes through these dark paths, right? But it gets somewhere. Right? That's how I personally like to see that. And and not often, not always it goes the way it should. Like, that can also self-destroy the whole system at one point. And it does happen. It did happen. on some occasion. But it's at the same time how even those countries today, I mean, developed the story how they built up their own identities, their own political organizations and traditions and lifestyles and mindset, and that's part of us that in the way it developed. So yeah, these are the things I really like to think about.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that thought process, and I feel like it's short-sighted from a generalization type of standpoint to like pick a particular date for, okay, so on this day, in this year, in this place, this entire society went from being yellow to being purple. Like just like that overnight. And I feel like in many publications and in many lines of thinking, when people are taking a look back at stuff like this, they tend to kind of have that very vanilla standpoint, and that's what I think that my natural process to kind of avoid that vanilla standpoint is what has led me to have like such a broad spectrum approach to history, as opposed to I'm going to specialize in this half of century in this one location, and I'm going to know everything about this. I don't feel like there's too much of a point to that. It's about humanity, and to me, it's the humanities as defined in modern society is many things. It's migrations, societal evolutions, governmental evolutions, religious evolutions, psychological evolutions, and just all these different things. Like this type of study deserves a much broader approach to in any attempt to truly understand, which we're not going to be able to truly understand, but you're going to do better for yourself in any attempt to truly understand something that took place in the distant past by analyzing all the factors that could have led up to something that is one of those points in time that a vanilla mind considers the transition from yellow to purple happening overnight. Like this, anytime I'm presented with one of those kinds of transitions in time and in geographical terms, my immediate response to that is like to get as open as possible, like I'm diving down and I have a parachute over my head and I see this tiny little speck on the ground and I've got to like navigate my way down to that little speck on the ground, and with consideration for every element that's taking place while I'm on my way down to that little element. And that's what makes me really, really love to study history, even as an amateur. And it's been a love of mine for such a long time, but I think it's really rooted in psychology and human behaviors, because as much as I love historical events and historical happenings, I think the driving force behind my love for them is my just like fervent desire to understand humans on a ground level.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of leads me to go into like these hyper analyses and things, and it never allows me to be super duper specific. Like I cannot possibly pick like one single century or half century or anything like that and apply that to a certain geographical setting and then just master that. I mentally I'm incapable of that.
Yeah, and that's really the right approach. There was a French historian, Marc Bloch, who said, as a historian, you have to be like an ogre who smells for, human flesh. That's what your objective should be. The human dimension as such, and framing it. And I think the Viking history in general is very useful for this because it shows you how this relatively confined population actually spanned across like a huge geographical space and meeting so many different populations at once. So you can actually look at every single of them and see how they dealt with them. And there were very different responses. They also show you how dynamic, how flexible, and that they were, and then what kind of effect. That is a symptom of civilization. Even for people that lived at the outskirts of civilization, that tells you how much potential they had. It was amazing if you look at especially the later Viking era, and also in fact the transformation of the Norse into case of you mentioned Rollo and the Normans, and eventually how effective we were also in replicating. They were very fast learners, and they were extremely effective in replicating what they learned and applying it, sometimes even in better fashion than the people they had learned it from, with Frankish feudalism, like Norman feudalism in England and Sicily is a far more advanced system than the one that the same French monarchs had. At that point, because it's a great civilization accomplishment, and it is true that you can't absolutely not just watch, conceive history like in this one only in unchangeable setting fashion, but also observing how there's not really you can't really use a teleological approach or deterministic approach, because in all of these events, there were lots of back and forth, right? There were failures. Think about, I don't know, the colonization of America in the Viking era, that failed. Or, this civilization also passed through sufferance and through frustration and to thinking over things and then refining your mind, because of that, and then finding a better solution, and that's where a people grows, right? And where civilization develops, because that's your mind that grows with that. And yet you do lose something in the process, which is also very sad, but it's unavoidable, right? If you want to achieve something, you have to be willing to lose something else in the process, and there is no way out of that.
Certainly. And I think about the Scandinavian trade network during the High Middle Ages, and kind of during the peak of the Viking Age, beginning of the 11th century, and I like to compare that to the capabilities of the Silk Road. And my opinion is that what the Scandinavians were able to accomplish in terms of actually at one point being able to attach Mesopotamia to northeastern Canada, that's that is the Silk Road is like a child compared to that.
That's true. That's the civilization I was talking about, right? And it's very overlooked. And you know what? That teaches you also how, everything is asymmetrical. Objectively, the Scandinavians at that point were still lagging behind, but it's the means they did develop that allowed them that function exactly to achieve that. You take obviously naval engineering and what they were capable of doing with that. Well, that's exactly what they needed, and they were able to do that like no other people at the time was able to in that way for that use, because there was a reason for which they developed that, and that allowed them to reach that result. It's how there are different paths through which you can get to one point, and they change every time in the meanwhile.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me that they didn't develop the sail on their own for their ships, and that the introduction of the sail to the Scandinavian world, well, maybe to the Anglo-Saxon, or to the modern day Saxony area, that northwestern Germany area, that really changed everything. I think that single technological introduction into the Scandinavian world was like the fuel that allowed it to become what it became. And it's from what I understand, that the introduction of the sail into the Scandinavian world came from the Islamic world. So the Islamic world circumnavigated the Christian world and introduced the sail to the Northwestern European world, and ultimately that proved to be like the firing pin inside of a rifle that shot these people out all over the world at that time. And it's just remarkable to me.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, it's true. Aside from the fact that Muslim merchants did travel as far as they describe certain things that we don't really know whether they read it in the Hellenistic manuscripts that now are lost and that they knew when they invaded, the places like Egypt and Syria, and they found them in the libraries. I think they actually went up to places like the Arctic Circle to see certain things. So they did travel into Scandinavia, to the Viking world, let's say, to the Norse world, and it's also with the technology. This is something I like to say all the time. Is basically that also consider probably maybe it's not just that they. I mean, yeah, these influences existed, but it's not maybe like that they completely found out of the blue of sail and all other novel technologies, but just that they started investing in them when they, there were certain environmental factors that allowed them to do it in the first place, so that they, maybe what they had before just with oars wasn't that bad for what they needed, right? After all, even during the Great Northern War in the 18th century, like the Russians still used galleys against the Swedish, vessels, because of the Swedish coast that is all, very, very, I don't know how to say that, very, very disordered, let's say. There are certain depths that are very, very, very small, so that favored them. So maybe that is also a factor to take into consideration, that there was something like that pushed them, that together with technology it also contributed as a determinant factor, but also a new energy, a new resource, like either moral or physical, that made them decide to do that choice in the first place, which is not a few. As I was saying before, just imagine having lived always in a world where this was unknown, where that opportunity was known maybe, but nobody had ever dared to take it, because they knew that people traveled by sea. The Anglo-Saxons had done it in the past. That they knew how to do it, but they decided to implement it in a way that up to that point was unknown. And that's a big step. Big step, psychologically speaking. It takes a lot. What to us maybe seems simple, in practice it's not simple at all, even to think, to conceive, right?
Right. And so that makes me think about the comparison to, so like, understanding that the Scandinavian adoption of putting sails on their vessels kind of like allowed them to explore further west and then into like the Shetlands and the Faroe Islands, and be able to reach the northern coast of Pictland and things like that. It makes me think about the fact that the Egyptians and I know it's a completely different time period, but it makes me think about how they didn't have the wheel, yet at the same time as they were, say, building the pyramids, the people of the steppe had wheeled wagon carts that allowed them to transport their tribal societies from one place to another. And it's sort of like it's another, like, it's another reversal, I suppose, like kind of like some of the things I was mentioning before. It's And it's like you said, it's a matter of necessity. And
Yeah.
I think the understanding of what was happening in their trade networks that they were easily able to access via just rowing into the river systems and things like that, and the evolution of the religious landscape and how that affect the governments in the mainland, combined with the introduction of the sail, gave them an opportunity to explore further, and maybe in search of the sort of societies that they were going to be able to easily interact with, as opposed to these societies in which even their tradesmen and their merchants would be, if not outcasted from, perhaps even punished for kind of just like being who they are. And so they were trying to find different avenues of approach to be able to maintain the standard of living that their general populations were accustomed to, which had been being stripped away from them, politically speaking, up until that point. And that's another fascinating element that, in my opinion, kind of propelled what most people would just kind of like refer to as the Viking Age.
Yeah, who does need a wheel when you have water? You can't simply go on. That is overlooked. I mean, how cheaper it is to travel by sea than on land in those times. When you have the Nile or the North Sea, right? You would take that because that's the fastest way, and it's incredible how well acquainted they, how natural, especially for the Norwegians on average, to just go by sea, because that's objectively the greatest space that opens to you, the greatest opportunities that exists, right? So it's impressive and how that influenced in turn also their certain technologies, certain combat styles as well, because like fighting in Norway is a bit different than fighting in Denmark as a territorial. So that's how much humans can adapt, and how and they're gonna find the best solutions after all.
Yeah, and that makes me think about the fact that the Roman Empire in the West did not collapse. And this is why I say this, is because that societal standard continued to exist. I think it was more along the lines of the government in Italy became inept, and this growing societal, I don't even know how to phrase this, like this standard of society that was growing and then had been put in place by the Roman government in the West, it became stunted by the lack of efficiency coming out of Italy. And so these peoples wanted to continue down this path of evolution, and then in doing so, it continued to grow the Christian element in particular, with the way it tied into the government, and then with the papal influence, and that ultimately forced the Germanic peoples from just beyond the Rhine at that time out into the further outskirts. And then in the early 5th century, the Romans abandoned the British Isles. And so the rest of the people that were left were kind of like forced to the outskirts, while the same process that was taking place in the Eastern Empire, as far as the Christianization of the people and all that, was still taking place in the West. It just was under multiple flags that were kind of like in their own way emulating what they thought the empire would be. Over a very extended period of time. And like I said, this forced those peoples to the outskirts, and in those territories, it was like it was like they were about 2 centuries behind in the Isles and 3 or 4 centuries behind in Scandinavia, and the same exact processes took place on these outskirts, and the adoption of different technologies uh, allowed allowed for that to continue, as to where if you don't adopt these technologies, and you don't recognize uh, these lines of thinking in terms of hierarchy, then you're going to be up against a giant that you cannot defeat. So it's like they had these couple of extra centuries to like kind of continue out what was taking place before. If you look at late 5th century, early 6th century outskirts of what was left of the Western Roman Empire at that time, um, the processes that were in place did not slow down. As a matter of fact, during those times, the processes that were taking place prior to the complete ineptness of the Roman Western imperial court, uh, it was like they had to do away with that court in order to be able to proceed. And so their evolution could continue to take place, but only as they were first forced further and further onto the outskirts. And so, like, if you think about Charlemagne himself and the Carolingian Empire itself, it was sort of like this delayed continuation of what was already inevitable. So if you compare that to what was happening in the East, it was very similar. No need to get into the specifics religiously speaking, but it was the same broad spectrum religious development that was taking place in both places. And so in the Far East, you had the people of the steppe being ultimately pushed further north and further east as the Swedes came in through the river systems into Central Europe, and then made contact with Constantinople, and that whole society developed, the Kievan Rus society, that ultimately led to, like the Teutonic Knights in Prussia. And then out on the northwestern landscape, those areas that Rome could not conquer herself and assimilate into its society itself, was being forced into existence by these leaders who were coming from the outside in, as opposed to trying to attempt something that they were incapable of from the inside out, as the court in the early to mid 5th century Roman aristocracy was attempting to do. So it's like they were like, you people can't do this. We're going to stamp you out and do it ourselves. And so, like, through Clovis and then into Charlemagne, and I apologize for my lack of more direct terms when it comes to that, but so the Merovingian and the Carolingian empires, it was like the process continued, but instead of originating from Italy, it originated from like central northwestern Europe area, and that forced the outskirts of that world to kind of like be on its own. So they were basically like a mirror image of what was happening on the outskirts of the Rhine frontier during the 3rd century, but like 5 centuries later, but the same process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think especially when you look at what fascinates me, at least, about these systems in Latin Germanic Europe, fundamentally, in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, is always how they had, because we have this idea, the West fell at one point. The empire kind of disappears from Western Europe. But telling you the truth, if you look at these societies and the kingdoms that were being built, they felt to be within this broader imperial system, we can say, sort of the imperial commonwealth, because they didn't believe to be strictly within the empire, like especially Merovingian, Gaul, etc. They had their own kind of ambitions on their own, but they lived into into this perception that the empire was still there, technically speaking, and they could share its its prestige, its authority. I mean, even in Anglo-Saxon England, albeit I think a bit late in time, like in the 10th century, you find even I don't remember actually the document, but one of the Anglo-Saxon kings appointed himself in one document as, or called themselves, let's make better, as Basileus. That is the Eastern Roman imperial title, right? And how it was used.
Right, and that came from Mycenae. That actual term Basileus came from like Mycenae or 7th, 8th century BC Greek world.
Yes, and this great model, in fact, that were shared from, that were very ancient. They were based not just of the Roman Empire as we know it, but from this greater, from this much older idea of, let's say, of divine sanctioned authority that all of these peoples shared, even when they were outside the empire, including the Germans, including the Scandinavians. These peoples believed fundamentally that every political authority comes from that in these warlike tribal populations, incidentally, is a military authority at the same time. It also elsewhere, telling the truth, but in that sense, in those regions, the relation is more it's less separated, socially speaking. Came from the divinity of the sky, from the Indo-European conception of the celestial deity, that for which no man's victory is a human victory, but it's just a divine one. So even the legitimization of earthly rule derives from this celestial deity, and all these peoples, thinking also about the Varangian guards and all the Vikings that went, the Norse that went fighting in the Mediterranean, in Constantinople, they kind of recognized, right, because I would think this idea was that, look at that great empire, look at Miklagard, as they called Constantinople. That was something amazing for a person raised into 10th century Norway.
Completely foreign to them,
at a civilization, like they knew that they thought these people's god is kind of a one I want to benefit from as well, right? And by serving it with this military culture that, incidentally, the Byzantines needed in terms of human resources and manpower to hire this. At this point, we can say professional warriors at that point, because if you have left Scandinavia, you're going to fight there. That's what your business is. You're a true mercenary. You're a true professional. It was all shared in this broader system, according to me, and that's deeply overlooked. And that could explain so much, also in terms of the curiosity between all these peoples, and how, aside from the Christian elements that obviously, rises from every source of the time, because that's the formal, that's the frame from which every source was written in that sense. You see that there was this common ground that you can even find later on into chivalry and into this warrior feudal culture that stemmed from this ancient common, also clearly pagan values that also Christianity inherited, telling the truth. But because the concept of the militia Christi and the Christian knight is essentially taking a lot from that too, aside from the Bible, of course, that has a lot of military models, but also from this strictly, we can't say European in part, was shared also by other peoples. But in that context, it was at the base of Christianity was relatively young, if you think about it. All these populations came from a past of millennia of these other beliefs that were essentially tribal and warlike, and that didn't die out, just overnight, right? So that's also fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also relative to, like, you take Julius Caesar all the way back to that, for example, and prior to the origin of the Praetorian Guard, Julius Caesar was taking on these sort of mercenaries that were Germanic
Yeah.
for his own protection, and so now you're sort of like eliminating the political element, the possibility that someone from within your own court is going to have an in with one of these persons who are your protectors, and be able to, essentially assassinate you. And so hiring these outside sort of mercenary forces was nothing new to the Romans, and I think it's important to remember that the term Byzantine and the separation of the Eastern Roman world from the Western Roman world, especially after the evolution of the West, it contributes to a severe short-sightedness in the understanding that this empire was contiguous. It was the same thing the whole way through. It just sort of evolved, and it evolved in the West differently than it evolved in the East. But the fact that someone like Alexios Komnenos could hire the Varangian Guard in the same way that someone like Julius Caesar would hire Germanic tribal cavalrymen, it's the same thing, basically. And
Absolutely.
it's a fundamental tool that was used multiple times throughout a period of 1,000 years plus.
Exactly.
1,400
more
years.
than that, I would say, when you think that these were pagans into a Christian army, right? That with theism makes it even more interesting. Like at the time of Julius Caesar, the German bodyguards were, they had other gods, but they were all like pagans. That's how they shared some beliefs. But the Varangian Guard is fundamentally a bunch of heathens that fight for the most Christian power out there, and that's the same reason why during the Crusades, but also into other areas like Muslim Spain, and so you find so many Christians into Muslim armies and so many Muslims into Christian armies as well. And that makes you understand that religion at that point is just, just finding someone that is outside your society you can kind of make dependent on you, and that you can trust in that sense. And it was used over and over in it's a constant. And the German and the Scandinavians in this sense were like they had like the most favorite sport, let's say, in the Germanic world, like in the migration era, was to go out there to fight into the Roman army for a while and then come back home. Right? We know from people from Denmark, from certain burials, that they were Germanic warriors, but they were proud, extremely proud of having served into the Roman armies and then having come back to their homeland. And this went on and on. And what is even more fascinating in this sense is that all these Germanic populations throughout all this time, and sometimes even after centuries that they had migrated somewhere else in Europe, they still shared this sense that they had come from like the north, like from Scandinavia or whatever, which also makes you see how how close they perceived that world, even just geographically. I mean, there were peoples during migration era were knocked out by others. That what they do? Well, let's come back to Scandinavia, and that's how it happened for the Heruli, for example. It happened for the word. Like it's that's impressive because that tells you that, despite these peoples didn't write, so they didn't leave any record for us to written record to understand better their point of view. But probably they were opened to the rest of the world actually since a very long time before. In fact, they're silent in our history doesn't mean that they weren't part of that and they didn't understand that, and that in part explains to me how effective the Viking activity was at the end of the day, because you realize that they kind of understood what was going on around, and they knew how to intervene into that.
Yeah.
And take profit from that.
Yeah, and there's like a pinnacle image in my mind of what you speak of, and I think it was Harold Hardrada that migrated into like Kievan Rus Teutonic Knights territory all the way down to Constantinople, Miklagard, and became one of the primary leaders of the Varangian Guard, and then ultimately made his way back home and became the king of Sweden.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a great representation.
Yeah, please go on.
Oh, yeah, I was kind of awestruck, but just by thinking about it, because it's as well as I've been aware of. I hope I have the right person with Harold Hardrada. I'm pretty sure I have the right person, but the process that you were describing just now is kind of, in my opinion, epitomized by what happened there, because if I do recall correctly, he not only came back to Sweden, but then that was around the time towards the end of the North Sea Empire, or right after that empire sort of came into crisis, and then he took advantage of those certain fundamental shortcomings that had been taking place on the post end of that, and kind of rejuvenated that spirit within the Scandinavian peoples. And this was a man that was outside of Scandinavia for 25 or 30 years, something like that. He came back. He was probably 50 years old. Yeah, and that's just remarkable to me, and it's a true testament to what you spoke of in terms of how it was. You could become a living legend by going out and serving, and then returning home. Whether it was in 1st century BC Rome, or whether it was in 11th, 12th century AD Byzantine Empire, which I hate to call it that, but I just use it so people will understand it.
Yeah, I also use it. I don't make a fuss about that, but it should be Roman Empire straight, like without even Eastern, because what's Eastern? Like it wasn't a repartition anymore. Yeah, I mean, Harald Hardrada is really like the best. Like it's, his death is objectively. You understand why that closed the Viking era, ideally speaking, in a temporal, scansion. Let's say, think about that man and how many, and how many interactions, because he went. When he fled from Norway, he went there, as you rightly said, to Kiev, and in there he started fighting like against for the Russians, against the Poles, the Pechenegs, even the Estonians probably. Then he went to the Byzantine Empire, and he fought in there. He fought in Asia Minor. He fought in Mesopotamia, very likely. He fought in Sicily. Like all this under the imperial standards, and then he came back once again to Norway. He seizes Norway. He invades. He attacks Denmark after some trouble that had existed there, and then he invaded Britain, and that's where he dies. But that's a hell of a of a curriculum. That tells you as far as, and also how. By the mid 11th century, how many resources Europe was putting in motion at that point. I mean, the Crusades started just a few decades afterwards, so it's that's the system that is overexpanding at that point.
Yeah, and Harold
to pour somewhere else.
Harold Hardrada worked directly as a commander or a near commander to two powerful, what is called them Roman emperors now, with Basil II and then Alexios Comnenus, over what, like a 20 or 25-year period, directly leading or assisting in leading the Varangian Guard for both of those emperors, if I'm correct. I don't know if I'm correct.
At the point he overthrows also one of the one of the emperors because he was involved into like these were like, in fact, strictly kind of imperial units at that point because they represented the core of the elite at that point, close to, siding with the imperial guard itself. So these guys reached to the top, and that's where he made all the money, by the way, that he sent to secure into Kiev, where Yaroslav the First was controlling them for him, and that's the well through which he comes back to Scandinavia, and he does what he does, and he tries even to revive the great Northern Kingdom that had collapsed just like in the previous generation. After Knut the Great.
Simultaneously helping to bridge that gap was it was the work of Vladislav. I think we talked about him recently, you and I, and he was the one that really essentially developed that entire world, in which he sort of eliminated some lesser competition from the northwest area of the Black Sea region, like from the Kievan Rus area, and helped bridge that gap, and then that became a short-lived empire in itself. In the late 10th, early 11th centuries, so it's late 9th, early 10th centuries. If I'm correct, I need to study more in that area. It's very fascinating to me, but it's to me it's just as relevant to me as the happenings in the Western European area. It's probably equally profound, if not more profound. Because when I think of Vladislav, I think about the fact that these marauders from Sweden, who, as you stated, were essentially generational professional mercenaries, being merged with what I view as Mongols, and thinking about the military machine that the combination of those people would be capable of propelling forward and propelling against their enemies, it's mind-blowing to me, because you can strip away most of the technology at that point, and you think about just a fighter as being a fighter, and if you think about a Viking combined with a Mongol, and what that fighting ability would be like in terms of like horse archery plus being able to wield a heavy sword, and the general military capability of that combination of people
those were tough people indeed. In fact, even physical prowess at that point was a big deal, because I think Harald the Red was like 2 meters tall or something like that.
Yeah, he was like over 6 feet.
Scandinavian was pretty tall for that time, like 6'1".
Yeah.
Around that, and that's amazing, because there was a very tough selection, even physically speaking, and that therefore it was really about even not everybody could do that. And in the case of Harald Hardrada, indeed having fought for the Kievan Rus against all of those surrounding peoples was a big deal. In fact, and it's a pity we don't know that much about that world in general. And it eventually was literally wiped out in the 13th century by the Mongols proper. That changed the face of Russia, and that transformed it into something very, very different from what it had been before. But indeed, the Kievan Rus at the peak of its power managed to wipe out, like, I don't know, the Khazars, for example. That was particularly important because many of them were Jews, and many Jews also came into Eastern Europe to revive the local cities and trade came from there. After the collapse of the Khazar Empire at the hands of the Rus. And they had, in fact, these massive contacts, even with, as we were saying before, with countries like Sweden. At the point, you can see that in Swedish military culture, like, scale armor, like, and this myth also that the Vikings didn't use the horse. That is probably one of the, or even the Anglo-Saxons, just because, you read some chronicle that says that traditionally they didn't fight on horseback, but that's more of a cultural idea of the ancient warrior that dismounts because he, fighting on horseback is considering that you can run away, so it's kind of a cowardly fashion. But these guys knew how to fight on horseback, and hell how they knew that, and that they knew it very well. They might maybe have not had the infrastructures and the political and social system to develop like heavy shock cavalry like the Franks were doing in Central Europe, where, with the French plains and the massive agricultural resources that they had compared to Scandinavia. But these guys knew how to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, even Harold Godwinson, if you see, as an Anglo-Saxon that allegedly should have not been accustomed to fight on horseback, like we know, he went to fight into Normandy, like a Norman, like at that point one of the finest cavalry that existed. He fought on horseback on the Welsh frontier, for example. That proves that such prejudices are completely devoid of, any evidence practically.
Well, I think
tells you how.
I think practicality is what's absent there, and the reason I say that is because access to horses is important. It's not like you can just have a bunch of horses in Sweden because they live there. Yeah. So it's a matter of adapting to your surroundings in a very human way, and then taking advantage of your surroundings. And if you have a large horse population, like they would have had in the Kievan Rus area during that time, then absolutely you're going to take advantage of that, because why wouldn't you? And if you can emulate anything similar to like a heavy shock cavalry, even similar to that of like the Roman Emperor, shoot, I can't think of his name. I'm on the spot now. I put myself on the spot trying to think of his name. Emilianus.
Well, there we go. It was interesting about what we were saying.
Well, in the late 3rd century, the Romans.
Aurelianus, you mean?
Yeah, Emilianus, but it was
the one who put all the empire together, right?
That was Aurelianus. It was another emperor, but anyway, they gained access to a greater number of horses from the northeast or northwestern Black Sea region throughout the abandonment of Dacia, and they kind of like took that with them and then developed that into a much greater cavalry, and that was the first real powerful cavalry that the Roman Empire had. But it was a matter of resources is really my point, and the Vikings as a whole did a great job of taking full advantage of whatever resources were at hand, and I think that was nothing new for them, and they were obviously very accustomed to doing that in the harsh lands of the Scandinavian north, and so as a Scandinavian, as you work your way south and you develop society and assimilate into society in a southward fashion, you are gaining access to more and more resources. And so their ability to incorporate and evolve those resources to suit their own means was remarkable to me.
Yeah, and resources that came also from far away, like, William the Conqueror's horse was essentially a Spanish, like it was a Berber horse that they imported from Africa, like because that's what they needed. In fact, also in England later on they would breed the king. But if you look even at least in Denmark, at Danish horses, for example, were larger, like Denmark, that being a flat land, having peculiar environment, you realize that their horses were actually larger than the Anglo-Saxon and also the German ones of Central Europe, and actually the relation between the Scandinavian warrior elite and the horse was much stronger than we think, even before Viking era. Like if you look at the noble warriors of the Vendel period, for example, and they represented themselves with their armor, heavy armor, and their horses on horseback. And in fact, in Scandinavia, the bond between nobility and horses is as strong as you find in the south. So in fact, the Viking hero, for example, in the sagas has a horse, has a horse with a name, right? That goes with him everywhere in all of their adventures. And there's the Battle of Lake Banner, for example, that distinguishes a battle of the times of Ottar Vendil Krake, was a chieftain of the 6th, even 7th century, and this work basically mentions the name of every single hero on the base of the horse that they rode. So this is deep stuff. Like you realize that aside from the availability of certain breeds and the possibility of disposing of them in massive numbers, like the Franks did, for example, still the idea of that the nobleman is a horseman. Well, that's deeply rooted into Scandinavian culture, as much as basically all over Europe at this point, because the migration here had left a very strong mark. But even from before, there was this idea in the Celtic or Greek mythology. You see that the horse is there, and that all comes from the Indo-European background that all these peoples shared. And even when they settled down, they sedentarized, they still remembered that they came from the steppe, and that they had all these deities that struck on horseback, like these warrior conquering figures, and that's impressive. That's probably also that gives you the psychological dimension of how these people thought the world like. That it was a very violent and dark vision of the world. Telling you, we know them. We know this from their own art and how they conceived the world. It was a very, very dark warrior conception of society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was very tied to nature, like far more tied to nature than
absolutely
we are today.
Absolutely.
And that's what I would commend the Scandinavians for the most, is that they, throughout this entire period, from the early 8th century really through to the end of the 13th century, they did a fantastic job of migrating, assimilating, and adapting. And in doing so, they were able to exercise certain levels of authority in certain ways that ultimately propelled them to be leaders of populations. And that's something that can never be stripped away from them, kind of like regardless of how anyone looks at it. Their impact on the modern world today, whether it be the Western world or the Eastern world in terms of like Central Asia and then ultimately Russia, it's as profound, if not more profound, than what the Romans did. And that to me is endlessly interesting and is relevant.
Yeah, but you know what? You mentioned this comparison with the Romans is very, very poignant, very useful, because you know what these people did have in common is that they were, being primitive. They had a very fast growth, and they, in the process, therefore, they didn't have that cultural resistance to the external that other more solidly built civilizations had, right? That's the way they learned fast, because they didn't have a strong cultural resistance. It's not like, I don't know, the Byzantine Empire that fell in love with itself and kind of sclerotized even culturally at the point that they started undervaluating overlooking what was happening around and modifying accordingly. These peoples were being primitive. They had this very quick rise that allowed them to include so much more into their own culture, right? And I think this is important.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel, and I go back onto what I said about like a sort of reversal in approach to I don't know if it was a reversal in approach as much as it was the way society sort of dictated that these approaches be reversed, but as to where I was making the comparison of how the Roman expansion into Europe was a sort of, for the most part, like peaceful assimilation of settlers into these societies and the adoption of their local deities and all of those kinds of things. As time went on, it was almost as if these roles reversed, and it was like either you're in or you're out. If you're not going to be part of what we have going on here, then we're going to stamp you out. As you know, it wasn't like that prior to then. It was more.
But also the Romans had their dark side.
Oh, certainly.
They did wipe out entire. People. But they had the intelligence of giving them the option to assimilate, while others would just come and destroy. Like the Romans understood that if they wanted to have an empire on their own, they had to include these guys, because that's where the strength of Rome came from, right? Mm-hmm. But if they didn't want, like, you were done, especially if you rebelled after that you had submitted to Rome. Like the Romans did pretty massive massacres on their own, like that.
Sure.
But it's how I mean, to say it simple, I don't want to say it because I love the Romans myself, as you probably know, but that was the standard, right? It's just that the Romans knew how to do it better than the others.
Yeah.
On most occasions. Let's say the smaller tribes and peoples, in my opinion, weren't much different. Like on their own, they did their atrocities at the same level. Like it's just a matter of who has the bigger guns, That's where, unfortunately, very often it comes to. That's also what civilization passes through, unfortunately, because we all know Rome, in fact, and many other peoples we don't know their names anymore because they were wiped out.
Yeah, wiped out.
But it's significant that you brought this up, in my opinion, because there are these changes over time. There are these impossibilities to sometimes even to reverse a certain change, in my opinion. At one point also becomes like the social structures, like the Roman Empire. At one point it reached its own maximum of expansion, maybe, and at that point it's a bit like the Carolingians, in my opinion. Like they overstretched. They didn't have a political and social system that could cope with an internal balance, and they simply tore each other apart, because and at the end of the day they did most damage to each other than actually the Vikings or the Saracens or the Hungars did to them. So but these are, I mean, they're objectively they're the sad and also depressing stories, but paradoxically it's from the crisis that you get the probably you get people to rise once again, like feeling the need to better that situation and to make a big effort. It's an effort of desperation and of failure that brings to great achievements, like also the one of the Vikings did, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you completely, and I don't mean to downplay at all the atrocities of the Romans, but the reason I take the approach of reversal is that just the approach to developing society became different, because I think from the Roman perspective, it was a matter of development, and from the late first millennia European perspective, it became a sort of like a get in or get out kind of approach. And that within myself, as someone who's interested in these topics, there's a certain like psychological religious paradox tied to that, and a lot of my opinions kind of are formed upon that basis. So I never intend to come off as being short-sighted when it comes to like the atrocities of the Romans and things like that. It's just by comparison, it's relevant to me because of the way like the same sort of events kept taking place, but the formation of those events sort of like ended up doing a reversal, like a 180-degree reversal over an extended period of time, as to where in the first place it was, you know, we are coming here to make you part of us, as opposed to, if you're not part of us, then you don't belong here kind of dynamic.
This is a fascinating perspective. Like, honestly, I had never thought about it. Now you give me a lot to think about that. And just like instinctively, I can think of one thing, is that objectively the Carolingians, yeah, they were trying to emulate the Roman Empire, like they were growing like a competitor of the Byzantines, etc. But also they, in the sense, they recognized they were smaller. Like, compared to the Roman Empire, of course, there was a truly ecumenic empire, because let's be honest, Rome did conquer the whole world, objectively, because that world was that, and the Carolingians didn't. So there was probably this greater also attrition and different psychological attitude to the neighbors and the how they had to be brought under their rule, that objectively, yes, was different. And I get what you're saying in this sense. I understand that it is true. That's quite important also to point out.
Yep. I missed the last part of what you said. People are coming home to the house now, so I'm gonna end this recording.
All right.
It's been a very fascinating conversation. We should definitely continue. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was great. I had a lot of fun, honestly, and it was great to listen to you and to discuss these topics.
Hey, thank you. I'm very happy to have been able to provide any kind of feedback that fascinated you and gave you a different perspective. Sure. As I've listened to you over the last couple of years, I've broadened my perspective immensely in the way I kind of analyze information and events. And having that, being American as I am, even though I have military experience and I've traveled around, and I've always been relatively cultured in terms of being open-minded about the way society is, not only intercontinentally in terms of the United States itself, but abroad. It's always been important to me to never have a particular lens, like an emotional lens, or like a homegrown
Absolutely.
lens in looking at the way the events of history have unfolded. And you've helped me drastically along the way, just listening to, I mean, I've spent hundreds of hours listening to you speak, and it's helped me. Well, you've provided thousands of hours, so I mean, it's important to me to be as cultured as possible and to have as broad an understanding as possible when it comes to analyzing historical information and developing a realistic perspective on it. And I think you and I together sort of share this similar mindset, but the differences between us are geographical. And that allows us to be able to come together in a certain way that made it so that we could create this project. And I'm very happy that we've done this, and I can't wait to get the video rolled out, and just I'll end up listening to it myself probably a couple times just to hear how we interact.
All right, yeah, it's great. I must say thank you, of course, for what you just told me. I didn't expect. And I wanted to show you're not relatively cultured. You're absolutely cultured in the sense that it's evident that you do reason, like starting from an objective ground, and that's what makes it absolute, and that's the best possible approach, and probably one of the most difficult ones in absolute terms, especially for a historian. But it's like if you consider philosophically a historian, like every person who is trying to understand something fundamentally, well, that's really probably the most important thing, and the best one, the one that can provide more quickly and more effectively with results in that field. So you do a great job, and I you can easily understand from your videos and your channel. That's a great piece of information put out there, and great insight into Constantinian times in this case. But talking with you today was it's evident that that's not just your Constantinian niche, that you know how to deal with all the rest. Like today we spent a long time, and that's evident. So this made this experience even greater, and I want to thank you very much for also coming up with this initiative. And I think it was very good, very successful.
Likewise, and I would like to thank you for being receptive to the idea. I felt like reaching out to you when I initially had the idea was kind of a long shot, and we both made time for it, and I'm certainly pleased with the result. I learned a lot. I was able to open my mind further, and this has been a great experience. So for YouTube purposes, I'm Harry LaFontaine. My channel is World of History. I've been talking to Schwerpunkt. His channel is anonymous, but I'll put a subscription link in the description, and we're going to sign off. You got anything else to say?
No, I'm just saying that it was great, as I just said, and I hope you enjoyed this video once again. And I'm Schwerpunkt, and I'm sure we will be working together again soon, right? So thank you very much again. Bye.
Goodbye.